Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I have an amazing story today. I found it in this 110-year-old book, just a little teeny book, but it is an amazing story. It's about the life of Niels Eskildz. He was born in Norway in 1836. His mother and father were direct line descendants of noble, titled families. This entitled them to higher education, though they received no financial benefits from it. They were unassuming country folks, but they were very well known because they were extremely large in stature. Niels's older brothers were both referred to as giants, and his sister was known to be one of the largest women in Norway. At the time in Norway, there were no fences, so livestock was allowed to roam freely across the countryside, and in the evenings, children could be seen leading their farm animals back home. When Niels was 10 years old, he was tasked with bringing their family cow home for the evening. And even though the animal was usually very docile, one evening it went berserk, and Niels was tangled in the tether and dragged a great distance and received crippling injuries. During his recovery, he was confined to bed for 3 years. His family occasionally carried him outside and laid him in the sunshine, hoping it would help with his recuperation. But even this seemed very exhausting for him. His mother was his chief caregiver. She also tried to provide education for her boy at home. And as she did, she taught him a craft that would serve him throughout his life. He did needlepoint and did fine work with the needle. At the time, the Lutheran Church was very dominant. Even though the king had declared religious freedom for everyone, each child at the age of 13 was required to attend catechism classes where they were taught the Lutheran doctrines. When Niels was 14, he was finally able to hobble to these classes on his crutches. And the first week, one girl in his class asked to be excused, saying that her family had converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Niels began to suspect that the priest was also converted, because every week after that he spoke highly of the LDS Church and quite often taught the young people their doctrines. And this struck a chord in Niels's heart. He began to feel that these teachings were true. At the conclusion of the catechism, each child was required to stand before the congregation and be questioned. And if they passed the exam, then the priest would take them by the hand and put his hand on their head and confirm them a member of the Lutheran Church, and then he would pronounce a blessing. When he put his hand on the head of Niels, the gift of prophecy came over him. And this good Lutheran minister, Holgar Thride, pronounced a blessing on Niels and said, "The Lord has laid a heavy hand upon you in your youth, which will be a hard cross for you to bear throughout your life. But it is for a wise purpose, to prepare you for a great work that you now do not understand. After you have traveled thousands of miles to a strange land you know not of, you will there eventually have a chance to go into the sanctuary of the Lord, to do work for your father's family and your ancestors that they do not understand or know anything about." This prediction made a deep impression upon the mind of Niels. He remembered every word of it throughout his life and felt that it would somehow be fulfilled. He did not understand how a helpless cripple, confirmed invalid without money or influential friends could ever travel thousands of miles over land. That seemed impossible. Indeed, it seemed unlikely he would even live long enough to make such a journey, even if he was able to find the finances to make it possible. To everyone's surprise, Niels lived through his teenage years. But when he was 18 years old, his mother passed away. At the age of 20, he was forced to move to Aalborg and live with his uncle and aunt, but his welcome soon wore very thin. His ability with fine needlework was soon discovered by a family friend, and through her kindly efforts, he was able to sustain some of the income he needed to survive from aristocratic Lutheran women in the area. One day, as he pondered his future and the reality of his existence, a glorious vision burst upon his mind. It was not a single scene, but like a moving picture. He beheld with his inward eyes what he later came to understand was his pre-existence, and there he was offered a glorious eternal reward. However, for him this reward could only be obtained by his mortal suffering. He must in fact be a cripple and endure severe physical pain and privation and isolation. Niels accepted these conditions, desiring reward. Throughout his life, he humbly accepted this arrangement without contempt or rebellion. He received comfort, satisfaction, and resolution from it. One of his neighbors were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they were very kind to Niels. He spent time with them and heard them teach the gospel in their home, and these teachings rang true to his heart. He began to attend church with them, though he never indicated that he wanted to be baptized. Meanwhile, Christopher J. Kemp, a missionary in Norway from Arizona, had sought refuge from a heavy rainstorm in a barn to sleep for the night. As he lay comfortably in the dry hay in the barn, he was suddenly awakened by a hand on his shoulder, and a voice said, "Go to Aalborg and baptize the cripple." Obediently, Elder Kemp got up, got dressed, and made his way through the dark and rain to Aalborg. That afternoon, when he arrived in Aalborg, he found Niels and told him he was there to baptize him. And Niels said, "Well, I haven't asked to be baptized." But when Elder Kemp described his experience from the night before, Niels agreed. And on November 1st, 1862, Niels was baptized a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He lived a meager existence and just barely had the necessities of life, and he frequently tested himself to see how little he could survive on. Even though he had extremely limited funds, he never asked others for help. It was something he had been raised to be independent. Because of his crippled condition, he was approached by a Lutheran priest who said that a benefactor had bequeathed a legacy to be granted to a worthy person who was physically helpless and dependent. And a Lutheran council that administered the funds had determined that Niels was the perfect candidate. He began to receive $10 a quarter, or $40 a year, from the fund. Niels was able to save most of this pittance. He someday hoped to immigrate to Zion. Unfortunately, the Lutherans found out that he had joined the LDS Church, and they cut off his funds. And despite his weak condition, he appeared before the Lutheran Council and demanded his funds. He had had a feeling that the benefactor had not specified that the individual receiving the funds had to be a Lutheran. So he argued that he was entitled in every way for those funds and that they did not have the right to deny them to him. After a long parley with the Lutheran Council, they made an offer of a limited time payment. Niels refused their offer, stating that he was entitled to that money for the rest of his life. And then he reminded them that his family was known for their longevity and that he would receive those funds for decades to come. The council conferred with one another and then made another offer. They offered to give him a 3-year lump sum if he would abandon his further entitlement. Niels accepted. Suddenly he found himself in possession of the funds that allowed him to immigrate to Zion. He had demonstrated that despite his physical limitations, he possessed great personal strength. He had a sedate, reserved, and self-possessed nature. He was a keen observer, a good listener, and a logical, discriminant thinker. He spoke discreetly and thoughtfully. He had a high sense of honor and a respect for others' rights and feelings, and possessed a deep charity for the weaknesses and feelings of others. He belonged to a proud and dignified family, and he was proud of himself, but he realized that he did not present a dignified appearance. He was constantly reminded that people were repulsed by his appearance. This wounded his pride and led him to times of misery and isolation. But he began to prepare to immigrate to Utah. Besides his other conditions, he had suffered from asthma throughout his life and could only sleep in a seated position. Because of his extreme handicaps, most of his acquaintances felt he would not survive a long sea voyage, let alone a journey across the United States. But he ignored the pessimists and arranged with a newlywed couple to assist in his immigration, and he contributed to the funds they needed to make the journey. They traveled by steamer from Copenhagen to Germany, then on train to Hamburg, where they boarded an ocean sailing vessel for New York. During the 8-week crossing, their company was locked in a hold, and Niels's sedate but wise nature was called upon several times to settle skirmishes between his fellow immigrants. 4 different times his calm nature was able to organize a fire brigade to put out a fire that the cook had again started, and they finally arrived safely on the East Coast. From there, they traveled by rail and steamer to St. Joseph, Missouri, and finally by riverboat to Nebraska City. From here, Niels was obligated to walk over 1,000 miles at the pace of a snail, with only the assistance of his crutch. He left camp early each morning to get ahead of the company, who soon passed him, and he trudged through the darkness and joined them after nightfall in their camp. As the journey progressed, he enjoyed the society of his fellow immigrants. By the time he reached the plains of Wyoming, his asthma had gradually been cured. At the end of the journey, Niels said that he had begun to feel like he was a Western man himself. Upon his arrival in Salt Lake, he sought employment, but this was not easily obtained. He found 2 sisters who were making buckskin gloves to sell to overland travelers. He worked for them. When this market fell off, he began to make the uppers for women's shoes. Because of his meager funds and abilities, he lived like a recluse and occasionally suffered for want of food. Several times he poured out the last saucerful of flour from his supply to make a little cake. Miraculously, when hunger again impelled him to search, there was enough flour in his stores for another cake. And so, while his faith in mankind was sometimes wavering, his faith in the Almighty only grew stronger. He tried not to rely on friends, feeling that they would last longer if they were not used too much. He possessed entirely too much independence for a pauper. He developed a thrifty disposition, but periods of sickness unfortunately depleted his stores. Through his first years in Salt Lake Valley and his miserly ways, he was able to save $5, with which he purchased a lot on the north bench above the inhabited district in what is now known as the Avenues. In 1888, he was able to sell that lot for $500. With that money, he was able to buy a small lot with an old home on it. He sectioned off a tiny portion of the home for his needs and rented the house for $5 a month, half of which was used for his annual tax bill. When the Logan Temple was completed, Niels arranged to spend 8 weeks in Logan, receiving ordinances for some of his deceased ancestors. This experience made him feel that he was coming to his own. There was something exalting about the thought that he, deformed, weak, and frail as he was, could do this for the salvation of his kindred dead. Niels had long admired missionaries who had traveled across the world to gather Israel. Now here was a labor with the same purpose, in which his abilities measured up to the full stature of any man. However, after 2 months, he reluctantly returned to Salt Lake to resume his now monotonous earthly endeavors, earning his meager necessities. The Manti Temple was soon to be completed, and a good friend had moved down there, anticipating to spend his declining years engaged in temple work. However, his friend was stricken with sickness and had to return to Salt Lake to convalesce with his daughter. But his condition only grew worse, and as he began to feel he would die, he sent for his friend Niels and appealed to him to help him complete the names of his ancestors. Niels promised that he would. He then copied the names of 70 of the man's relatives. He was then advised that there was a sister in Manti who had agreed to help with the female names so that work could be accomplished. His friend died in peace, knowing that Niels would fulfill his promise. Niels soon afterwards made his way to Manti and looked up the sister who had promised to do this temple work for his sisters. Unfortunately, her health had also declined, and she was no longer able to assist in the work. So Niels hired some sisters in the area to help him complete his friend's female ancestors, and he spent the next 10 weeks in Manti. Niels returned to Salt Lake and was now anxiously looking forward to the completion of the Salt Lake Temple. He had found his true vocation. Soon after the temple was completed, he devoted every available moment to temple work. His reputation as a fine seamstress soon provided him a small source of income, sewing temple clothing. He had meager needs and spent the majority of his time hobbling to the temple, spending his days performing redeeming ordinances for God's children. After he had officiated for all of his kindred dead, he was approached by others who were anxious to have temple work done for their ancestors. During this time, people hired other people at 75 cents a day to perform ordinances for their dead ancestors. Niels did do some of this, but the majority of the work he did was for others that needed help. A Scandinavian sister that he had met working at the temple passed away. She still had over 50 names remaining on her list and needed their work done. Niels arranged with sisters to assist with the work, and he completed that list. Another sister, Caroline Corradi, from Switzerland, through vigorous genealogical research, had acquired several hundred names, and Niels agreed to help her with all the male ordinances in her behalf. His health challenges continued. He struggled with a painful hernia, which eventually was miraculously healed by priesthood blessing. In his 70s, he lost his voice, and for the rest of his life could only speak in a soft whisper. Undeterred by these earthly obstacles, Niels could be seen, rain or shine, hobbling with his one crutch and crooked earthly frame as he made his way about a mile each way to the Salt Lake Temple. He had spent his entire life deformed, crippled, and in constant pain, yet he performed all the redeeming ordinances for over 3,000 people. That's almost 250,000 ordinances. As his age advanced, the years seemed to have no effect on him. He offered no complaints. Though many witnessed his daily journey and work, none knew of his pain or want. He silently bore whatever was in his path. He selflessly worked as a savior on Mount Zion. He had no fear of death, but neither did he welcome it. Niels spent his entire adult life providing for his own needs and performing temple work for others. He kept to himself. No one around him knew of his constant suffering. He was seen as a self-sufficient neighbor who carried his own weight. Niels was confident that he would live a long life, and he purchased a lot at the cemetery and had his own headstone prepared and placed. He even paid to have his death date chiseled into the granite slab after his passing. Niels lived to see the fulfillment of the blessing he received from Holger Thryde, the Lutheran priest, when he was just a young man. Those who worked with him in his advanced years said the peevish, crabbed disposition that so frequently characterizes old age was never manifest by him. Instead, he exhibited the patient, serene expression of one who lives for a noble purpose. He served daily in the Salt Lake Temple until he was given his glorious eternal reward. He passed away on April 6 in 1925. He truly was a treasure in the Lord's hands. He now stands as a giant on the other side with those who love the Lord. The Lutherans got off cheap. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did. What a man. It really made me look at my own life and think about the things that I consider obstacles. The Lord loves each of us. He's aware of what we need to do to receive eternal glory, and he will guide us in those endeavors. In the future, I'd like to do an episode about missionary miracles, and I would encourage anyone with a missionary miracle they'd like to share to reach out to me in the comments, and I'll send you my email address. I hope you've enjoyed this story. You can subscribe here. And if you enjoyed this story, you'd probably enjoy this one. You can listen to all of Brother Merrill's inspirational stories right here. Thank you.